record. Hi, welcome to From the Research Chair. This is episode number 22. Bi-weekly, Michael Falk and I look at different investment issues. This week, we're going to be hitting investment talent, a whole bunch of things. And Michael, say hi to everybody.
Hi, everybody.
So Michael, this is something I can't believe we didn't start talking about this previously. Like, I'm surprised it took to episode 22 because you and I spend inordinate amounts of time talking about this subject. Why is this one important?
Well, first of all, you and I were having a kind of a dual Homer Simpson moment. And it's a talent business, folks. All of you are talented. We don't know in what, but you're talented. Everybody in the investment and wealth management business has maybe multiple talents. The question is, do we know what they are? Do we know how to leverage them? Do we know how to combine them with other talents on the team?
Is there an analogy? Is there an analogy you think works? In our Evite, we said something about putting together a band. Talk to us about that.
Well, you've got the people who write the music. You've got the people who write the lyrics. You've got the singer or singers. You've got a drum player, a bass player, a guitar player, a sax player, piano player. As many instruments as you prefer. You know, Earth, Wind, and Fire had like 1,000 people on the stage at once at one time or another. The point we're making here is all those talents come together to make our singular experience of the music.
I love that you dropped EWF in there. Philip Bailey, lead singer from Denver, Colorado, my hometown. So shout out to Philip Bailey. Of course, he's going to be watching the podcast too.
Well, and you know, his son is in the band now, playing along with him.
I didn't. Is he vocalizing?
He is doing some vocals.
Interesting. All right, so we sequenced this sucker, right? Like, so we imagined a sequence. So the first thing is identifying talent. Michael, talk to us about that. I have my own thoughts about that, which, as always, are probably more long-winded than yours. But talk to us about some of the nuances or secrets of identifying talent.
Well, if you're playing the game of football in America known as soccer, the players have to be fast. If you're playing the game of basketball, players have to be tall. So generally speaking, when we're talking about in the sports world, we have telltale signs. Good for the sports world, not good for a knowledge-based business, which we're all in, investments and wealth management. So the first step, and we did one of our very early podcasts on this, is I want to know about their level of curiosity. I think curiosity is a superpower. And there are ways, Jason, are there not, to kind of get at measuring levels of curiosity?
There absolutely are. And in an interview setting, you can ask those questions. Let's table that one, though, that answer, just because that'll be kind of the interviewing talent and the hiring talent and the facilitating talent.
So curiosity is one thing that I very much want to know about. I want to know about their interpersonal skills. More specifically, we learn about this as EQ, their emotional intelligence. Because if we're talking about getting the band back together, then what we're really talking about is a bunch of diverse talents working together. My biggest issue with the entire diversity movement for the industry, which I happen to think is fantastic, is they're talking about diversity, but they're not talking about how are we going to enable these different individuals to work well and blend together. Because you bring in a diverse population, you don't have good EQ skills, it's going to be worse than before. You need both things. So curiosity, temperament, which I'm using as a general for those EQ skills. How do they work with others? How do they tolerate? How do they bob and weave so that nothing seems to really punch them in the face and they can go on? Those are two things that I care deeply about with talent in this business, the interpersonal skills and their level of curiosity. So I'm going to give you those two And I wanted to talk a little bit more about them instead of just throwing them out, Jason, and ask for you to add to my 2.
Yeah, and one of the reasons, those of you familiar with our work and also our podcast, Michael and I do not prepare ahead of time other than the list of topics. And we do that so as not to influence the outcomes. And we find it interesting where our thoughts intersect as well as where we disagree. So I don't disagree with anything that Michael just said, but I actually would start earlier than the person. I think that one of the things that many organizations don't do well when they are building a team is stop, slow down, codify their investment philosophy, process, and execution in terms of what are the contributions to what makes you successful as an organization. Oftentimes, the investment philosophy is defined and it's in a marketing document. Processes may have been defined years prior, decades prior, but in our experience as consultants, Michael and I find that process drifts over time. And oftentimes it's been a long time since anybody checked in to see if individual analysts are actually executing the process as described, even in a marketing document. Execution ultimately can be measured with the outcomes, said another way, the performance. But what hasn't been done, usually because we're too busy and we're too absorbed in the investment process itself, is to take an inventory of what we do that makes us successful. Where are we, in fact, adding value, especially behaviorally? Do we have good checks in place? Do we have good discussions? Do we have clear decision rights? Do we have candor at a high level? Is it psychologically safe? Why do we start here? Because if we understand the things that contribute to our success, well, then we can hire for that. We can look for that. Oftentimes, the hiring overemphasizes the credential rather than the behavior or the individual, which, Michael, you were sort of highlighting. So that's where I would actually start.
And I'm going to bring 2 more things that because of what beautiful. Take a talent inventory of your existing team before you look to add any talent, because you want that talent to be complementary, maybe to fill a gap. So, Jason, wonderful lead in before we can even say curiosity or EQ, temperament, skills. We need an inventory. Oh, and you're going to start interviewing? Oh, resumes? Really? Come on, folks. It's the 21st century. Do we really need to talk about the bias that comes from looking at a resume, where they went to school, what their name is, what their activities have been? I've been an advocate for blinding resumes for a long time. You don't want to know anything about this person other than what their basic skills seem to be because of their experience.
Yeah, I'll add, I'm not a fan of CVs or resumes. I actually love cover letters. And almost every jobs board now, because of the number of applications are sent and because of the stupidity of machine learning. Said another way, machine learning really can do well with bullet point lists. They can't do so well with natural language processing to actually tease out behavioral insights. And I get it. We're trying to narrow down. Like when I got hired at the Davis Funds, I was one candidate out of 550 people.
And that was like 1,000 years ago. Now there's like 550,000 applicants.
Yeah, I mean, it's insane. I get it. I get the problem. That said, hiring credentials is tough, and here's why. Overwhelmingly, the candidates think that they have the more stressful side of things. It will change their life if you hire them, no doubt, in a very positive way for many people. They will go from struggling student of some sort to probably, person who lives comfortably for the rest of their lives if they're competent and skilled. But I would argue firms have the harder job. And the reason why is we're inviting somebody into our culture that's already established, our way of doing things that's already established, so on and so forth. It's obvious. But are we really confident that 1 page, 2 pages, if you're a really kind organization, is going to help us identify the people that will fit in there? Can you imagine it's almost like doing the dating profile thing based on 1 or 2 pages and sorting that way, which many people do. I think that's so old-fashioned, and I think there are other ways to go about it, which we'll hit in a second. One way would be start asking people to submit essays, personal essays, cover letters, so on, so that if they check the boxes on the credentials, so be it. The other thing I would suggest is actually do, as Michael suggests, do it double blind. Get rid of the universities that they've gone to. Keep the credentials in there because they can be important. They're shortcuts to, I don't have to train this person, so my expenses are maybe covered. Get rid of the names, get rid of the geography, so on and so forth. The other thing I would recommend is every once in a while, interview somebody that you would have passed up. I would argue that in any job search you're doing, if you're going to interview 10 based on all the criteria you normally use, just choose some at random or choose the ones who almost made it. And if you can't tell the difference between the candidates, then it means that your front-end process isn't really sorting for you.
You know, it's so interesting, Jason, that you just said that. There is a noted behavioral expert who has talked about admissions to college and how they get, 100,000 applications for 1,000 seats. All right, I'm making numbers up. Don't worry about that. He said out of the 100,000, there may be 20,000 that are qualified for 1,000 seats. How do they pick the 1,000 out of the 20,000? He goes, you know what they should do? It should be completely random. Once you have gotten past a certain level of established competency, everything else is so random. So I don't know if we could bring that into the investment and wealth management industry with credentials, because I'm not a big fan of gating mechanisms. And let's be candid, requiring an MBA in finance or a CFA are gating mechanisms. But I do recognize that it does show some level of dedication and sticking to something to see it through that coincides with the industry.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of credentials either. I say this as a person who has hired analysts. I also think the gating mechanisms are poor. I think it's a tough problem. I actually think of the hiring process, this is the toughest problem. You get a huge stack, how do you sift? It is a really tough one. And the best I can come up with is natural language processing, which can get very sophisticated these days, but not on resumes. It needs free form extemporaneous speaking. I worked with another focus consultant, our colleague Keith Robinson, several years back to help a venture capital firm with their hiring process. We actually encouraged them to start having candidates author personal essays about in answer to several key questions. And then they were able to evaluate using NLP and an engine that we helped build out. We were able to sort on the types of behaviors that they were looking for. And interestingly enough, it was a differentiated pile than the CV sorting, which is how most organizations would do. And this technology is not that expensive. It's there, but we've put the emphasis on the credential, which is also the resume. And the fact that people can charge you $500 an hour to write your resume is proof that it's a broken process, right? It should not be that. The other thing I'll poo-poo is headhunters. I think headhunters stink. Sorry if there are any headhunters and recruiters on the call, but every time we ever used a headhunter, we always just said, hey, just send us your top 50. Like thank you for sorting from 500 down to 100 or whatever. We'll take the next 100 or the next, the 50, and we'll sort them ourselves. I think headhunters are a poor choice in my
Well,
experience.
yeah. And you want to replace a headhunter, the easiest, simplest, cheapest, most successful way to do that? Every current employee in your organization should be keeping an active Rolodex of people they think highly of that are in the business, that when and if you need to bring more talent in, you have some phone calls ready to be made.
In fact, that was on my list, Michael, in prep for today, is like, how do you solve this problem besides what we've talked about? Is it behooves us as investment professionals to maintain that network. That's something I learned only too late in life, because I'm a little bit more introverted than a lot of people. And I specifically insulated myself in my investment work because I didn't want to be overly colored by other people's thinking. And so that meant that network was not as important to me. Where it hurt me, though, was post-career, right? Okay, great. It also hurt me in terms of the hiring process. I didn't know who to call necessarily. I've since rectified that. And now I know if somebody came to me and said, hey, Jason, do you have a recommendation for who would be a good research analyst? I know the answer to that. I think that is a much more solid way of solving this problem than the CV.
Someone who lives in the water that is your organization saying, I got someone who I think would be a great fit.
Michael, what do you think of the idea of, I'm just thinking, spitballing out loud, of HR every once in a while asking the investment team for a list of such people, even if you're not in hiring mode, just so that knowledge is taken out of the brain and put in something that's more transparent?
I think it is fair play. In fact, when you think about establishing your expectations for the roles in your organization, the responsibilities that your employees will ultimately accept to execute, why not make that one of the responsibilities?
I love it.
You need to provide that type of documented information. Oh, we just got a great comment. Some feedback, I take it, on that point, Jason.
Christine, I know. Christine, thank you for your comment. Feel free to go off mute and talk to us about it.
We do welcome participation. I don't know if she's comfortable doing that. Oh, she is.
Comfortable doing it. I just had to sort of figure out where it was. I'm eating my lunch too. I apologize. So love your point about employee referrals, and typically folks know what is going to work and what isn't going to work, but there's also a significant body of research that says most of us spend most of our time with people who are kind of like us. We have the same habits, hobbies, intellectual predispositions. So when you overly rely on employee referrals, you get more of the same. And it's really a conundrum when you're trying to build out a team. I loved your idea about doing a skills audit before you move to hiring, making sure that you're complementing what you already have. But I hear a tension between employee referrals as a network, as a sourcing mechanism, and the other stuff you were saying. So I just wanted to hear a little bit more about how you guys reconcile that.
Christine, thank you. Wonderful piece of input. To me, the best way to reconcile that is ensuring the team is diverse to begin with, because then if one like person is referred in, it doesn't augment the homogeneity of the team because the team is diverse to begin with. That to me is the single best defense. But I hear you loud and clear. For example, Jason and I both we've worked with firms, let's say in the Northeast United States, I won't get any more specific than that, who only hire from the Ivy Leagues. Now, these are smart individuals, we'll say generally. Okay, now, I poked somebody with that, I know. Listen, same background, got into the school. Same professors are teaching the same coursework. Their knowledge base is not diverse. So, Christine, one of the other ways, make sure that the schools that people have come from are different or geographically diverse. They're from different places in the country or the world.
So I won't name names, but I'll name the firm. I worked at the Davis Funds, public record. But somebody at that firm had given advice to the hiring manager to never hire anybody who went to school west of the Mississippi. Well, that included me. They did hire me, thankfully, and I turned out to be Lipper #1 manager, took over a 2-star fund and turned it into a 5-star fund, et cetera. And at the board dinner, when I was sitting next to this person who was responsible for the statement, who had gone to Yale, and he was congratulating me on my success. I said, not bad for a kid who went to school west of the Mississippi. And the point is that we get so obsessed with the credential and we're trying to infer something from the credential that in my experience just isn't there. In a world where information moves very fast, unlikely that there's a big secret knowledge base that's being transmitted at Harvard necessarily. And are we really measuring their skill and their hard work? Or are we just measuring somebody's ability to be a great student? Which is useful, maybe, but I want a great investor, different skill set. So anyway, I think we should move on just because we've spent some time on IDing on the front end, but then let's say we've got there. I think our business is overwhelmingly a fairly simple business: buy low, sell high. We can describe our whole business in 4 words, but we tend to think that it requires a huge technical background. I would argue that I want the emotional makeup and the brain makeup to be much greater than the technical makeup. Our business is very jargon heavy, and jargon sucks to wade through and, you know, put on a map and try and understand and use this term and whatever. I've coached people who are traders, and they are not necessarily from the investment business, who have a whole nother jargon, but they're still describing the same phenomenon. You can name the phenomenon without the jargon. Anyway, my point is, look for these, Michael, you named some of yours before. I also have curious. I think it's a superpower. You've convinced me it's a superpower. I think it's important. Systems thinkers, in my experience, have been better investors because they're able to connect the dots. They also tend to, with that curiosity, then be able to know why the study of buffalo herds and flocks of birds, how that relates to understanding markets. Oh, gee, markets herd. Oh, so somebody who is curious has studied this, they can link up that knowledge of herding science up to an investment decision-making.
Can I provide one of my favorite systems perspectives to help people understand what this is another way? In my first book, I talked about retirement. If we fix retirement, we make it better for more people. If we don't fix healthcare at the same time, we got a problem. If we don't fix lifelong learning at the same time, we got a problem, because everybody says the big solution for retirement is to have people work longer. Well, if they're not healthy enough or they don't have the relevant skills, they can't work longer. That's a systems approach. You cannot fix one thing without impacting others. You have to fix them all in concert. That would be my first book.
Yeah, and to that end, probably the smartest answer to a question of like who makes a good investor that I've ever heard was, it's somebody who knows how to manage everything. That sounds exhausting, and that's part of what makes the business stressful. But a systems thinker actually finds that a wonderful challenge. People who are not systems thinkers are overwhelmed and have anxiety about that. So that's one. And there are questions that you can ask, and we'll get to some of these questions to sort of get at who's a systems thinker or not. Creativity is something that's almost never hired for. And by the way, of my whole consulting roster, I love creativity. I think it is the same thing as alpha. And that's the thing that most of us on this call are trying to pursue and hire for. And yet we hire the same bland credential over and over again. And we hire people because we don't understand the meaning of the word analysis. We tend to think of it as logical, and we tend to think of it as data-driven. That's not what analytical really means. I'll give you an analogy that reveals that. If you have a crime scene, say a bank robbery, and you invite 20 detectives to solve the crime, yes, there's something to be said for the fact gathering and the techniques for the fact gathering. Yes, there's something to be said for witness interviewing and that sort of thing. But the detective that solves the crime is the one who has discernment, knows which facts from the tens of millions that are possible to collect are the key ones. They're the ones who ask the correct questions of witnesses. They're the ones who actually piece together and see the picture that's in the mosaic. That requires a high level of creativity. We just don't interview for that. I've never, ever seen an organization that interviews for that. And that used to be my ballbuster question, which I've said on the podcast before. I would ask people about their level of creativity in their investment work. Oh my God, I only ever got 2 good answers to that question. I heard one guy sheepishly offer that he played the guitar. I said, okay, that's great. That's wonderful. I'm glad that you play the guitar. Do you write your own songs? No, I play other people's songs. Okay, well, so tell me how you being able to play the guitar relates to making better investment decisions. Compare that to the following answer. I asked this question of a guy who's gone on to be a badass real estate investor who we hired. That same question, what do you do that's creative? And he said, well, I'm not sure what you mean by the question. I explained. And he said, oh, okay. Well, so here's the thing. I bring creativity to all of my decision-making. Yesterday before the interview, I worked in Santa Fe. I wanted to get in some skiing because I figured, hey, if I don't get hired, I'm at least going to get in some good skiing. So I came down a good day early so I could go skiing. I evaluated the weather report and I saw that the day before it had been 50 degrees up on the mountain, but it was going to dip well below freezing overnight. It was foggy. I'd never skied this mountain before. I wanted to make it alive to the job interview. I also considered the level of wax on my skis. Anyway, went through all this whole process, which was, yes, analysis, but he knew which facts were important. He had a maximization thing up at the top. I want to make it alive to the job interview tomorrow. Oh, and also have some fun. So he was clear about that. And he said, and then I skied the mountain based on all those criteria. Bingo. That is a systems thinker. It's also a creative individual who is evaluating the proper nature of the facts. I hired him on the spot based on the answer to that question because I'm like, this is somebody who understands his mind and how it works. And those people are tough to find, no doubt, but oh my, what a difference.
And you can test for that, can't you, Jason?
You can't test for it. Yeah. So
not just in interview questions, there's an actual test.
Oh yeah, there are lots of tests of creativity that we can make candidates endure. Systematic tests of creativity. There's one called, and of course the name is escaping me.
Oh, you're
talking about FFMQ?
Yes.
Oh, 5-facet mindfulness question. Well, that will get to a person's mindfulness and their thoughtfulness and self-awareness.
And the complementary to that is, come on, Jason.
I can't remember.
I've seen you use it.
I know. And I can tell you what it does. It's the remote associates test. That's what it is. The RAT. I was trying to remember my acronym. And it asks people to take 4 words that at the surface don't look related to one another, and then to come up with a 5th word. And it's a fill in the blank kind of a test. And highly creative people are really good at that test. Not creative people are poor at that test. And so I have used versions of that test in hiring before. Thank you, Michael.
You are welcome, Jason.
But in terms of systems thinker, one way to ask that and interview for that, you ask a question, whatever question is, what companies are you interested in investing in now, right? And so they give you your thesis. And then you just ask them lots of follow-on questions that are about interrelationships to different issues. So one example might be if they give you a very bottoms-up answer, you'd say, how does Federal Reserve policy factor into what you're doing? Okay, they give an answer. Talk to me about your view of the EU, and how it's going to perform, right? So then now have to connect it to something else. What do you think about the general political tenor of the country? Do you think that'll have an effect on anything? You can ask other bottoms-up questions. What's the competition like for that? Anyway, what you build is a network of questions around their opinion, and just see how easily and fluent they are at able to connect the dots. If they're systems thinkers, they probably already thought of those things because it will feature in their ability to answer that question. Michael, I'm hogging the air here, my friend. Please speak.
Well, it's not just fill in the blank to complete the sentence, right? Many of us have heard about the improv methods, yes, and. So what is the ability for you to actually make some sort of a statement and see what they can do with it? Can they yes and it? How creative are they with the way in which they yes and it? Or do they struggle? Stream of consciousness, can they run with what you just said? Another way of thinking about it to see, hey, how creative are they?
I love it. Yeah, dude, that's genius. So said another way, a balance of left and right.
Now I'm a squirrel.
Not a genius, you're a squirrel?
I'm a squirrel. I found a nut.
And you're preparing for winter, apparently. The talent winter.
Not in May. No.
Not in May. Well,
not in May. All right.
Next. Are you? So a balance of left and right brains, right? Left and right balance has been shown definitively not to really be true. It's not hard and fast, but the idea is a complementary skill set. Somebody who can, yes, be analytical, but somebody also who can be creative. I don't know if folks on our podcast, either live today or who will see this in replay on YouTube, have had the privilege of engaging with a truly world-class quantitative thinker. We used to serve on the board of the Santa Fe Institute. Murray Gell-Mann, now he's dead, was a Nobel Prize winner, postulated the existence of quarks. Thanks, Murray. So I spent the day with him because we're on their business advisory board at the Davis Funds. And, I was a young kid, arrogant kid, admittedly arrogant kid, which I still suffer from maybe on occasion. In any case,
but you're not a kid anymore.
Well, true that.
Okay, I'm just having fun with this.
But this was a humbling experience. So, I'm spending the day with Murray, and I'm 28 years old. And I'm like, hey, how do I check in with Murray? And I'm like, listen to Murray. And the whole day I'm like, I've spent 6 hours with this guy. I don't understand. I guess I'm doing okay because this Nobel Prize winner isn't that smart, right? He's smart, but he's not that smart. Oh, but here's the thing. Then in the evening, he lectured to the business advisory group about what he was working on, what he was interested in talking about. And this will bear fruit in just a second, I promise, in terms of job interview. Oh my God, is he brilliant? Oh my God, he's a genius. But you know why I didn't know that? Because he was forced to speak in the context of everyday language and not in the stuff that he was interested in. So here's one of the interview questions that you can ask somebody that will show, A, are they self-starters, but two, do they really have genius material? When nobody's looking, what do you research on your own? Talk to us about that. If they're fascinated by it, and if they're genius, you'll be like, holy cow, that is so interesting. But you have to give them an opportunity to express it. If you're with, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Tell me about a time you resolved a problem with a coworker. You're forcing them into this context and you're trying to hire the superstar. Genius exists at the margin, not in the middle.
I love that. So now you're a squirrel. This is good stuff. If you want someone, in Warren Buffett's words, that tap dances to work every day, what are their passions? How do they get to bring their passions into their profession? Right? We're not talking about actuaries here. No offense to actuaries, you're very important. We're talking about investment people. And we want them to want to be more knowledgeable, better breadth of knowledge, to see what maybe other people aren't seeing. Right? Can you imagine investing in technology today, biotech today, some of the medical tech? In some of these areas, you have to have a passion for this stuff, because to understand it is a deeper level of understanding.
Agreed. So last comment in terms of this initial, how do you identify talent? I love internships. I think internships with stakes. Right? It's not useful to bring in an intern and then not give them any stakes, because you're not getting a real world sense of how they perform under pressure. So, but believe me, I don't claim to have solved the internship problem, but I like to think we did a pretty good job of hiring them on the front end. In fact, that guy that we hired who gave the skiing answer, that was in an internship interview, not a for hire as an analyst interview. We ultimately hired him as an analyst because of his quality of work. But anyway, internship with stakes. What does that mean? Our interns always had the capability that if they did good work in researching a security and we liked it, we would buy it. And we would ask them, what percentage of the portfolio? We reserved veto power on the sizing and also as a check, but all of our interns always ended up having names in the portfolio. The day I retired in 2005, we still had all of our internship holdings in the portfolio. These are people who are, normally not in the hiring universe, but they should have been. But for the internship, they may not have been competitive. Anyway, I'm a big fan of internships as another way of identifying talent.
Condition with a condition that you're giving them real work to do.
Yeah.
There's stakes, to your point. It's not just about internship. It's about valuing and using what they're producing.
Yeah, and I'll give you, we typically, if it's useful, we would structure an internship. We usually we did it in the summer, right? And so we typically had 3.5 months. The first 3 weeks, we would describe sort of our process and what was important. But then we would say, look, we have brought you in here in part because we want you to show us how to do this better, in part. And if you don't, that's fine. But that way it was in context, right? It wasn't like somebody came in and, said something totally bizarre and out of context. And then we would, through questions, try and ensure that they got something out of the internship. Example, earnings calls, we would listen to with them, and we would sort of prime their pump as they would listen side by side, ear by ear with us on earnings calls. And we'd say, hey, listen for the following things in the earnings calls. And then at the end, we'd say, what content did you extract out of that? And let them answer. And then we would give them the pros view of what they may have missed. So there was an educational layer in there. So that's also of substance, though, because it's at stakes, right? Like, we're asking for their interpretation of management statements made on these calls. So
yeah, and another way of thinking about that, right? The interns are younger on average versus maybe your current team, which may be older on average. And we're talking about relative ages. There's a difference there. Listen, the whole world is shouting about how millennials are so different.
Good.
Yeah. Oh, you let it slip. The dirty little secret. We want them to be. That doesn't mean they don't need to be better. Doesn't mean that baby boomers don't need to be better. Okay. Well, what about Gen Z coming behind the millennials? Different again. Good. The world is changing. We may or may not agree with how it's changing. Doesn't matter. It's changing. We may need different skill sets to be able to deal with those changes.
So should we transition from sort of the correct candidate, right? So we've discussed two things: the criteria on the front end, which most organizations don't do. They don't take an inventory. Two is how do you hire these people, or how do you identify them? Three is the interview. We haven't really talked about the interview directly. We've obliquely or indirectly been talking about it a bit. I'll go first only because I've already said some things that feature in this category. I'm a big fan of a question technique that, to my knowledge, I pioneered, but not really pioneered. What I pioneered was codifying how to do it. And it's indirect context questions. We tend to ask direct context questions for which usually there's a prepared answer. So for example, an example of a direct context question, which is what most people do in an interview, is, tell me about some of your successes. What's a direct context question? You've established the context. They know exactly what they're answering. Likely they've rehearsed the answer. Likely so is almost every candidate. The only way of benefit of that question is the same benefit from watching the Indianapolis 500. You're watching to see if the car crashes. Really, like, if they screwed up the answer, they're eliminated. But most people are going to give you very bland, sort of middle of the road answers. So instead, you have to think about what would be the evidence that somebody had success would demonstrate, and then ask the question about the evidence. So for example, I said earlier, I wanted to know about creativity. The wrong question would be, tell me about your level of creativity, right? And that was how I presented it earlier. The indirect way would be to say, talk to me about something that you've developed. Like, talk to me about your systems you've built. So I've already assumed that they've applied creative process, and now I'm looking and asking a question about the evidence of that. They don't know the question is that I'm examining their level of creativity. They may think it's about the actual output that they generated. It's not. It's really about the creativity. That way you're able to trust the answer. Earlier, I said the question about the genius. The way to identify genius is not to say, hey, are you a genius, right? Most people would probably think that was a question of character, by the way. They'd be flipped out by that. They wouldn't want to volunteer that. Instead, you accept what would be evidence that somebody is genius, and that is that they are breaking new ground and they're passionate about something, and they're going to tell me something I've never heard before. So that was the nature of the question that I used to ask was, hey, when nobody's looking, you have spare time, where does your attention and your curiosity go to? Talk to me about that space that you're fascinated, transfixed by. That is asking a question about genius, and I'm assuming that they are genius already, and now I want to hear a question about the evidence. So that's IC questioning. Michael, I know you have some techniques too.
Well, I want to know. So Daniel Kahneman says the key to happiness is to minimize future regret. So I want to know what regret. Tell me about a regret or failure. I don't want to know about the embarrassment. I don't want to know about the pain. I want to know what you did with it. tell me about what you've done when things didn't work out the way you had hoped. That's what I want to learn about. Because, in baseball, if you hit 300 for a career, you could be in the Hall of Fame. Failing 7 out of 10 times, investments, we know really how many good picks, percentage-wise, 51%, 52%. We're not accounting for leverage or sizing. All right. I want to know how you're getting better and better. And the best way for me to learn about that is, what have you been doing in the past when things didn't turn out exactly the way you wished? This is a focus of mine, because it's about resilience. I think managing a portfolio, it's not a contact sport, but my God, this is hard. This is a lot of work when you take it seriously and do it the right way. How resilient are you? Because you're going to get some punches to the gut. Your ego is going to get damaged at times. How resilient are you? I want to hear about that.
A perfect example of that, when I hired my successor at the Davis Funds when I retired in 2005, the tiebreaker, because there was another strong candidate, was that he had, in the dot-com era, managed one of the most successful growth funds. He'd been up over 100% in 1 year. Oh my God. And then had a colossal collapse of over 65%. And what we liked about him was he had failed. And we knew goddamn well he was not going to let that happen again. And so but we wanted to measure that. So we asked questions about what he had learned based on indirect questions. We would just say, hey, talk to us about, this, what happened back in 2001, 2002. And then he gave his answer, right? Kind of related. And then we said, talk to us about 2003, 2004. And not the failure. We saw that collapsed. What did you do? Right? And just open-ended question. He answered the question highly successfully. And basically, he's like, I let my family down, was one of the things he said in his answer. He said, because I almost lost my livelihood. My wife stayed at home and worked. Oh my God. He's not going to let that happen again, right? The stakes were high for him. So another example of an indirect question, and Michael, you had asked a question before, we haven't hit ethics yet. Right? Ethics, hugely important to hire for. And one of the things I used to listen for was what was their real motivator for being in the business? For me, money was a part of it, no doubt. I think it is for many people. But I was listening for evidence of how do they get tickled personally? How are they super vested in it? I would ask questions about what activities they had done as kids. Were they the captain of the team, right? Like all these things. If I asked others who work with you currently, what would they say about you? These are all indirect questions trying to measure character. Anyway, I could go on, but ethics, I think, also key to interview for. Our business has lots of very intelligent, driven people. The number of people who also are ethical in that space, much smaller.
Yeah, and what is it? How is it said that the worst kind of person is an intelligent person who's unethical, right? Because they're the most dangerous. Good point to interview for, not always very simple to interview for.
Well, I'll give you an example of how it accidentally happened when I was interviewed. I was 28, went to a state school, University of Colorado, go Buffs. And I had on my resume that I had managed a Burger King at age 19. And the guy who interviewed me loved that. He said, why did you put that on there? I said, it's about me. I was 19. The next youngest manager was 28. Oh, and by the way, I got the highest shop score that the restaurant ever received. And he said, I love that. He said, most people would be afraid to put that on there. It goes to your character. Well, that wasn't why I put it on there. I put it on there because I was trying to bolster that I had managed something somewhere. But anyway, there are ways of getting at the ethical profile. Michael, anything else on this category? And then we'll talk about the hiring bit. How do you hire?
I want to push on, given the time left, to move on to the hiring bit.
So you start here. I started the last one. How do we hire well? We've got our candidate. Now what?
Well, they're complementary, right? By now, we know they're complementary to the team they're being hired into. Get them a mentor. It's a buddy system, right? In some way, shape, or form. When they come in, have somebody kind of assigned to them, even if only indirectly, because you want them to develop into that level of partnership with their teammates. And to me, that is the fastest way to do it. So they're not kind of splashing around in the pool where they just got dropped. There's somebody there to lend them a hand so that they're not drowning in it. So that's one of the first things I have is they come into a team purposefully with someone there to assist and be a mentor to some extent.
Oh, I like that. I like that. That was one of my complaints when I started the Davis Fund. So basically there was no guidance whatsoever. There was no onboarding program. It's like, oh, hi. HR, fill out the health insurance and your beneficiary and your disability or your disability and death policy. Like that was about it. There wasn't a whole lot more. And that was tough for me, honestly. I like that idea. I will add, once they're hired, they're not just doing the job that you hired them for, they have to grow. So have the end in mind, to the next phase already in mind, in terms of development. And we're usually thrilled that because maybe there's a gap on the team and they're replacing somebody who left or whatever. But from my perspective, I know this now. I didn't know it back in the day. So I have, this is new to me in the last two years. Thank you, Focus Consulting. Mastery, autonomy, and purpose. I would make sure that in addition to the compensation, they're properly compensated, that we've already thought about, can I give them opportunities at mastery? Is there something they're already good at that I've hired them for that I can facilitate in some way, somehow? Say they're good at Python and you think they would be really good at that. Is there a project that you can engage them on where they can use those Python skills to help other processes or execution within the team? Autonomy is awesome. And purpose. Try and hit the notes of what really excites them. For me, I literally saw my job and framed my job. And when people would ask me, hey, what is it you do? And I'd said, I work for my shareholders. That was it. That's what I did. That was what I got up in the morning to do. Can you give them purpose opportunity? Could be that you support a charity that they believe in. But these things factor into in addition to pay. So I think as you're hiring people, begin with the end in mind and hit those notes too. And
those three things, Jason, you combine them in addition to pay. They have primacy over pay. Because let's be candid, in our industry, pay is not a massive issue in terms of a difficulty or a problem. The industry is well compensated. Mastery, autonomy, and purpose are the things that will drive people to want to tap dance into work every day. Totally agree. So to me, that's my comment on hiring. And then, make sure they have a computer and coffee. Yeah, it's the end in mind with an appreciation of mastery, autonomy, and purpose and a mentor. You combine those things. They're not splashing around in the pool they just got dropped into. They have direction, they have assistance, they have appreciation for their skills. When you start talking about mastery and autonomy, you mix that cocktail together and you've got a winner. Yeah, and in terms of the autonomy, I will add, I don't know the individual cultures of our attendees today or people watching this on replay on YouTube, but it's ticky-tacky to have them get approval for a $100 magazine or journal subscription, right? That does not show confidence and faith. It's you're making decisions about tens of millions of dollars in terms of a sizing in a position. Oh, but by the way, you have to go through this bureaucratic process to get approval for, to subscribe to the Wall Street Journal. That registers badly with people. So be aware of that kind of stuff as well in terms of autonomy. I see organizations. Yeah, give them a budget, right? Here's your spending budget for whatever you think you need. And before you go use it, we just want to see how you want to do this because we may have other resources you're not familiar with. What a great way to introduce them to what the firm's reach and potential, what they have. And if not, go ahead and get it.
Yeah, begging with hat in hand and that also goes through processes like if they need an IT thing, I mentioned the Python programmer earlier, and they then grind into the IT project line, make sure the IT is designed to facilitate too. That's a whole nother subject that we've talked about before is where's alpha left on the table because the firm is not operating on all cylinders.
And if you want to solve that potential question, set up groups within your organization with younger people, newer hires, cross these teams. Sales and distribution being one team, operations being another team, IT is part of operations, and investments. Doesn't matter what team they're on. Have these different members from these different teams kind of grow into the firm together. You want to improve the culture over time. You want to get additional creativity. That's a great way to stoke it.
All right, let's hit the leverage note. How do we leverage talent? We've hit some of these notes. You sponsor them, basically, give them budget. How else do we leverage their talent, Michael?
I think autonomy is the biggest way to leverage them. Stop micromanaging your people. You hired good people. Trust it. Train them, develop them. Trust that, right? These smart, intellectual, academic-oriented individuals, they want to be free with their thinking. And the way that you rein them in so you're not worried is it's allocations or size in the portfolio. You have a governor. You don't have to worry about it. But the more autonomy you can give them, that's the best way to leverage them. And of course, as Jason already said, giving them the ability to play to their strengths, play to their interests with mastery. What is it that fascinates them? Let them play to that.
So the only thing I will add here, it's the final, I think for me, the final comment today is in that mentoring relationship, and also in the interest of not having bland sameness, I think it's really important if you've hired well, or if you've identified talent, if you've hired them well and you're leveraging them, to let them be themselves ultimately. Let them develop a style that is their own. I have often said that there are lots of ways to make money as an investor, and to insist that there's only one way is incorrect. And if we really want to unlock their genius, then the comparison is, are they their best? Not are they almost as good as, Mr. or Ms. Portfolio manager. And if they're doing their job well, their style won't look exactly the same as the other person. And so one sign that you've done this right is when you hear them describe their stories about how they succeeded, either over drinks or in annual reviews or just in team meetings, and you're like, I would never have thought of that before. That's super interesting and that's insightful. Then you can pat yourself on the back that you've unleashed them and they're confident that, and they're psychologically safe enough to have had their own style.
And that key, psychologically safe. They can't be their own person if they don't feel safe being their own person. And if they're adding diversity of thought to your team, they need to feel safe or you're not going to get the value. So one of the big leverage points, Jason, is work towards ever greater psychological safety on and across the team. Then you start leveraging all the beautiful differences of your team members.
So that's it for my prepared remarks. Michael, it sounds like it was yours. We have several minutes left. If you have questions, comments, hassles, complaints, as I like to say, now would be the time to...
You see it differently. Let us know.
Yeah, of course.
You can chat that in or unmute.
While people are building up nerve or considering the possibilities, Jeff, Ian, and Patrick, nice to finally have you on the call. I know you've made some of the other calls, some of you, but nice to see you. We see you register frequently, but not always join in. It's nice to see you. Sort of. We see your names.
Nobody is unmuting, and we don't have any new chats, I don't think, that have come in. Jason, I think they are either satiated or fed up.
Yeah, hopefully not the latter. So thank you everyone for joining. Michael and I always find this pleasurable. We hope that you got something valuable out of it as well. Our next podcast will be June the 10th. They're always on Thursdays. They're always at 11 Central Daylight Time or Central Standard Time, depending on the time of the year, or 11 Eastern, the equivalents. Thanks so much for joining us.
Bye, all. Thank you for joining today.
Bye.